Welcome, tabletop players from around the world. My name is Rune Ortega, and tonight I'm having a quick fix of dice and beans with my good friend and co-host Cade, because we are getting down to our very first espresso. Cade, why don't you tell the good folks what we're doing here with these episodes?
Right, so if our regular episodes are a nice big cup of coffee, then our espresso episodes are kind of like an espresso shot would be. It's a quickly digestible kind of mini segment, lets you get your fix without taking your entire day or taking a large chunk of time. In this episode, we're going to be going over Call of Cthulhu, but basically in each one we're going to be going through whatever game we just previously played, discussing some kind of supplemental materials that might be in that, some extra resources that you might want to go over to really kind of sink your teeth into our last game if you really enjoyed it.
That's exactly right. These are shorter episodes than the previous ones, designed really to get you started as a DM or a keeper in this case, and kind of pointing you in the right direction of how to structure your games or what resources to look at. Now, obviously, Cade, before we looked at Call of Cthulhu, how did that go?
It was fantastic. We really enjoyed it. We were exceedingly praising in our discussion of the system itself. However, we did have some concerns about the lore of the world that we're stepping into, because it is an established world that if you don't have pre-existing experience with or knowledge of beyond, like Cthulhu's got tentacles, it can be a little daunting. I know that you have vastly more experience in this world than I do, and you're kind of our resident Cthulhu expert. So what would you recommend as a good starting place for some of our viewers to jump into the Mythos?
Yeah, that is the term the cool kids use, those down with the craft.
I don't think cool kids talk about Lovecraft.
maybe not. You might be right about that. Here's the thing. I am by far not an expert on Lovecraft. I just really enjoy his writing. I don't enjoy the person. That's a whole nother conversation. Yeah, we won't get into that. But
his poor cat.
His poor cat. That's all you need to know. But I really enjoy his writing. I think he did something so great for literature, and many people credit him as being an inspiration. Now, with that, you're right that the mythos is established, and Call of Cthulhu, the game, uses that established lore and world to help flesh out your campaigns. I have actually gone through and I've picked what I would say are the 3 stories that anybody who's going to run this game should read. And in fact, I would argue that even your investigators or the players should read them as well. I know you have some experience with these.
Yeah, and something that I think is also worth mentioning that again, I'm only familiar with really one of the 3 that you picked out, but they're not these gigantic tomes. I think when people think Lovecraft, for whatever reason, just because of how deep the universe is, a lot of people think that they're these gigantic leather-bound copies that are going to take you months upon months to read. And again, the one I read, I plowed through it in a couple of hours. So if you're looking to dip your toe in, his stuff isn't immensely dense or time-consuming. You're not reading the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy to get in the base information. These are fairly consumable, bite-sized chunks that you can dip your teeth into.
Absolutely, they were published in pulp magazines. Exactly. He was paid for them, obviously, but they were really easily digested and read over by lots of people because they were so cheap.
Right.
And because of that, the length was kept down, and many of them were printed over multiple issues of that magazine.
And I'm sure a lot of that also comes from the fact that he was heavily inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, who's known for short fiction. He wrote one novel in his life, and other than that, it was all short stories and poems. Yeah. And there's a lot of research out there and a lot of evidence to say that Lovecraft idolized Poe and was that was the jumping off point for him to take it into the crazy world that he did. Well, definitely took the ball and ran with it.
Absolutely. And even in regards to the writing style is considerably archaic compared to when he wrote.
Yeah.
People did not write in the way that he did, and it's almost as in intentional or not, I'm not sure, but homage to previous writers.
For sure.
Some people would even say that he was a bit high on himself, but
I can see that. Not knowing the guy personally.
his writing though has lasted. That's not to say that it is easy, but it's also not difficult. You know, as much as we teach a high school student to read Shakespeare, this is much easier. So don't be afraid to get into it. Yeah. Now, the first one that I have recommended here is called The Whisperer in Darkness. It's about a professor who works for the Miskatonic University, and he begins writing letters to a pen pal from somebody who is equally as intelligent at the Miskatonic University. They start talking about the presence of Migo, which are a very famous Lovecraftian monster in rural Vermont, and he even starts sending the protagonist pieces of evidence that he's collected, and the protagonist does not believe in these things. However, his pen pal does, and over the course of these letters, the protagonist discovers that his pen pal is being watched by these monsters and being tracked, and he decides to go make a visit. Now, when he gets there, he discovers that things are a little bit off. He never fully comprehends, although the reader does, that his pen pal has been replaced by some of these beings from another realm. But he ends up fleeing with his life, thinking that things are going awry. The importance of this story to me really comes from the fact that this is one of the situations where you get the protagonist discovering that his enemies are from another part of the galaxy, another part of the universe even, or even further, and are exceedingly ancient. And so it's building up that almost cosmic horror impact, which is famous to Lovecraft.
Right, and that definitely ties into the concept of like the elder gods. Like these are gods that are older than time itself and more ancient than we can possibly imagine. These are beings that have not been created like a Frankenstein or have only existed in the time of man, like werewolves. These are things that are older than we can possibly fathom and have always been present, and we're just kind of uncovering them, which I think is very unsettling from just like this idea that rather than being something that man has created or something that has only come alongside man and therefore is naive and kind of more attainable, this is something that is lying in the waiting at all times, whether you know it exists or not, and has been forever, just biding its time. Absolutely. And it's just that omnipresence that is unsettling as a reader.
Absolutely. And it even talks within the story that these beings, the Migo, they come and go from Earth as they please, and they try to find a hidden valley to get minerals to take back to their world, wherever that is. But, even when you talk about they're older and stranger than you can imagine, that is key. To Lovecraftian monsters, they are unimaginable horrors. Literally meaning we don't really understand or comprehend how they look.
And that's one of the key criticisms that you'll always hear about Lovecraft, and I always find it funny because I get where he's coming from and I get the point, but it's always funny to be like, really, Lovecraft, you couldn't have described this thing any way other than undescribable. And it's clear, when you read it in context, it makes sense, and it's clearly this thing is so terrible and frightening that the protagonist or the narrator's brain has basically broken. There's no way they can conceive what they're seeing. But when you take it out of that context, it's man, that sounds real lazy, Lovecraft. Which it's not, but it's funny.
We give him critique because he can't actually use words, but it actually does play into the real human nature of what we call negative capability.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
The fact that the concept of love, sometimes we just can't actually describe things, and this is one of those things. Only he's using it for the purpose of horror, and when we are frightened of things, we often equate it to something physical and tangible.
Yeah. And this is something that we even I'm not sure how much Lovecraft would have known about this because psychology was still very new at the time. But even we know now, people who experience great trauma and great experiences of fear will repress those memories, and their brain will try to connect it to something that they're familiar with. Mm-hmm. This is one of the theories behind if you're a UFO believer. People are like, oh, it was a weather balloon. Well, was it, or is that just what your brain, the closest thing your brain could connect to it? And that is a thing that we know in psychology is real, not UFOs, but like your brain just kind of not computing things it doesn't understand. And that's something that he seems to play on, whether or not that knowledge of how the brain works was available during the 1920s.
And to the advantage of not being able to describe these things. And they do attempt to describe the Migo in this story, but I find it's almost slightly contradictory in nature, and that it works against itself. It's like, oh, they're crab-like with wings in the back, and it's like, what? Yeah. But we have found in a game that we have played that when you try to describe something too much, people disagree with what that means, and they get heated about your definition when you're just trying to describe something that's unimaginable.
And as fairly literary people, we really enjoy arguing about semantics, but we don't enjoy it in the middle of a game when we're trying to move along and accomplish something.
Yeah. And that was a moment where we're going to save that actually for a side table episode where we're going to talk about conflict in games, but realistically here, sometimes less is more, and that's a really common thing.
And that's become a trope in horror in general. There's a reason why you don't see the monster until usually the last half an hour. And once you see it, it's less scary.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The recent remake of the American Godzilla films did the same thing. You spend 3/4 of the movie not really seeing the monster, and then it pays off at the end.
Yeah, the Cloverfield series does this very well as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great movie. All right, let's move along to Call of Cthulhu, which is our next recommendation. It is obviously it shares the same title as the game for a reason. Now, you've read this story.
Yes. So I read this a long time ago, so I'm not super familiar with it, probably to the extent that you are. But basically what this story has as like its primary feature is that your protagonist, your narrator, has not actually experienced the events that he is describing. He is taking all of these different articles and newspaper clippings and letters and taking them all and kind of compiling them to piece together the events. And in that way, it kind of feels like a D&D tabletop role-playing adventure. Like, we have the same thing when we're trying to figure out what happened in this house. Is this cult involved? We should go to the library. We should go talk to the police, get all these things and piece them all together. And it has that same kind of feeling of the story is there, but you need to uncover it. And I think that's, in addition to, Cthulhu being introduced, because I don't believe he had been present in any other of his works, even though he kind of became the breakout monster of the world. That kind of, again, there's this horror going on in the world, but I'm not there, but now I know that it's there. And piecing these things together and uncovering this story, I think that's something that's really central to a lot of the horror that Lovecraft uses.
Well, it almost picks up on the idea that the knowledge that we hold is often more frightening than the actual presence of that horror. Mm-hmm. Knowledge is power.
Yes.
And what you talked about of putting together this story, this event that happened, that onion peel mystery, we really get the start of that in Call of Cthulhu, the story that is inserted then into the game, because the character is piecing together what seems like unrelated stories, but the further he delves into the mystery, the more layers he pulls back until he ultimately realizes that there is this elder god horror.
Yeah. And it's funny because the more we discuss this, the more it kind of clicks just how many horror tropes can be traced back to Lovecraft. This is the literary version of the found footage horror movie that is now readily available. There's one every year at least. A few years ago there was the big boom of 30 of them in a year. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of, that's what he's doing, right? The narrator, whose name I don't remember off the top of my head, but he is not there. He's just finding out about these terrible things and finding these threads that are not immediately apparent to people who would get these articles separately, and kind of piecing it together, and then again like slowly revealing the terror in the world.
Well, and the narrator's name is Thurston,
Right.
and I believe so. If not, people can send us all sorts of mail. Please send us mail.
Yeah, please.
We're lonely.
COVID's hard.
COVID's the real horror. So I believe Thurston, he is the one who's piecing it together, and he goes through several different. First of all, he's going through his like late uncle's, I believe, articles that he was left behind, and he's going from finding people who were involved initially in just collecting things to then going to, I found a story about these police going to this swamp to look at things and then finding basically a ritual happening. And then finally he goes to another country where he finds out about a sailor who had taken his ship to some strange island or monument where Cthulhu was rising, and ends up escaping narrowly with his life, but dies before Thurston can interact with him. I really just enjoy the way that this seems like such an epic adventure, and yet at no point is the character actually there.
Yeah. This is also, if side tangent for a second, if you enjoy this and this kind of format of writing, I highly recommend that you check out the book House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielowski, I think is how you say it. I'm currently reading it right now, and it follows a very similar kind of format where this guy, a friend of his has a old man dying in his apartment, and they find just like a trunk full of miscellaneous scribblings, and some of them are like articles and some of them are written on the back of envelopes, and this guy takes it and is trying to make some sense of this and put it all in order. And you get the pages are written in the way that the old man would have written it. So some of them are written in pen, and some of them, as like horrors are revealed, are written backwards and upside down, and as his mind is breaking, and you get like envelopes and stuff. And it very much like heavily inspired by Lovecraft and this kind of found footage narrator not there kind of thing, because the person who's finding all this is not, he wasn't around for all of these events, but he puts in his own little ideas as footnotes, and it's really interesting. So,
and this traces back even to Bram Stoker's Dracula, which uses that same style, where it's writing through letters. And there is a term I'm neglecting off the top of my head. It's like epistolary, or
I'm not that smart. I'd be curious to know what like the first novel or piece, well, it's probably a play, but like the first piece of fiction that was communicated in this kind of format. I'm sure it was probably a play, because like plays predate long form novels by quite a bit, and I'm sure it was just like you had a narrator off to the side writing as the events played out. But I'd be curious what the first example of this was.
Yeah, for sure. It's actually the epistolary novel, or epistolary style. But the thing I think that Dracula does even one step further is it doesn't actually have a narrator. It's all through just those pieces. But you're right, like these are all traced back to specific, and I would also be curious. I wonder, somebody out there must have the answer to that.
I'm sure someone
Or
does.
when the most generally accepted date would be.
Yeah, it's probably like the ancient Greeks or something.
Possibly they were crazy.
Yeah.
Doing math before we even understood what math was.
Didn't even have real numbers.
No, just weird little ticks and
Letters
lines.
and-
Yep, it's another conversation altogether. Okay, so lastly here we have the horror at Red Hook. I chose this one because when I was reading this one, it was the first one that I felt, and I had already started playing Call of Cthulhu. I had read a few stories, and my biggest qualm with the game was that, to me, none of it had really felt like I was an investigator in the stories and things like that. The horror at Red Hook, to me, was the first story I'd read that felt like I was a hardened detective going and finding and unraveling this mysterious cult-like ritual, because I had started with what was essentially murders and things like that, which some of the greatest Call of Cthulhu games that I've played are that style. And so when I read the horror at Red Hook, I was like, oh, I get it. It's there. Here's this detective who both officially and unofficially investigates this, and it ends with him basically in the middle of a ritual that goes awry. For me, investigators especially should read this one, as well as The Keeper.
Yeah, well, and it ties into that concept that we discussed as being one of the stronger points of the system that Call of Cthulhu employs, where you are not some omni-powerful He-Man type character. You're an everyman. You are an investigator. You're a beat cop, essentially. You're just there, and then you find yourself in the throes of something much grander than you thought was even possible. Not even just grander than you could see yourself in, but grander than you thought anything in the world was. And this story seems like it kind of is what birthed that kind of experience and that kind of atmosphere of being hopelessly out of your depth.
And when we talk about the everyman, this is very much a guy who is just doing his job.
Yeah.
And it goes from, I'm just doing my job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm 3 days from retirement.
Exactly.
Yeah. Where's Danny Glover? It's the guy who's just doing his job, and he uncovers something horrible, which I think is one of the strengths of that system, which we've talked about ad nauseum. But again, this is one where you really get into that mindset, and people should do themselves a favor and read this one. This is actually probably the shortest on this list, so I would recommend reading that one. Perfect. So now that we have some stories that people should read as kind of some, prior knowledge and getting into the headspace of going into these games, we have a module that we have selected that we think, if you're going to run this system and you've tired yourself out from the couple of campaigns that are in either the starter guide or the actual full Keeper rulebook, these are ones that are relatively cheap and come with the added bonus Keeper screen. This is the Keeper screen pack. It includes the story Missing Dues as well as Blackwater Creek, and obviously, as mentioned, the Keeper screen, which for those who are uninitiated is a little piece of cardboard that separates the person running the game from the people who are playing it, so that they can roll dice mysteriously and also just formulate the game ahead of time.
Create undue amounts of anxiety in the players.
So much. Sometimes I just roll the dice at random.
It does not for anything.
Yeah. I just go, and I roll. And people are like, and then I just grab them like I'm being mysterious. And I'm like, okay.
I'm preparing for my first DMing venture that hopefully will make it into an episode unless I totally bomb it. But I'm definitely going to employ that technique of just randomly rolling. Huh.
The best question I've ever seen somebody say is, which way do you turn the doorknob? Because everybody's like, oh, I go to the door and I open it. And it's like, okay, which way do you turn? And then all of a sudden there's this overwhelming dread that they're like, right, left, I don't know.
I think I go clockwise. I think I always go clockwise.
But in that situation, would you? Or would you change your mind?
I don't think I would, because I think I'm right-handed. So turning clockwise to me just feels more comfortable than going...
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
And you've played with me for a while. I'm pretty how would I do it? Not, is this what's best for my survival?
Perfect. So we've had a look through this module. I have actually had the pleasure of running these ones several times, actually. It's one of my go-tos when I'm going to run this system, particularly Blackwater Creek, which I believe is the first one in the book.
Yes.
Now, you've read over these.
Yeah, so Blackwater Creek is that was the first Cthulhu game that I had ever played. And you were my DM. So it was a good introduction. At no point did I feel like I was gaming the system, like you can sometimes get with D&D, like we discussed. But it's also fairly grounded in terms of how wild and crazy we know the Cthulhu mythos can get. This one is not astronomical, is not going to blow your mind. It's fairly grounded and would serve as a really good kind of stepping off point to get into something bigger if you wanted to have a bigger, more epic elder god appear.
If you wanted to get into the story and make it appear like your characters are just doing an everyday task and all of a sudden they encounter something awful, This is a very good story.
Yeah.
There are two options to starting the story. One is either that you are whiskey runners trying to find a new supply chain or a competing supply chain. And the other one is that you are looking for a lost archaeologist for the Miskatonic University.
Yeah, and that's the way that we went because we were playing with minors.
Yeah, we were playing with people that we didn't want to expose to too many illicit activities.
I'm sure they would have been fine, but their parents might not have been fine with it.
Yeah.
So we were covering our own butts.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing I like about this one is there are so many different ending points. There are points where you could either TPK several different places. There are also just places where you can either choose to end the scenario because like you found something awful and you just want to move on, or there's just that much more gameplay.
Yeah.
I have played games in this scenario where people explored absolutely everything because they somehow managed to survive. And I've also had places where they were like, no, we found this. We don't care about that other part of the mystery. And they were just done, barely living.
Yeah.
And
I think this is because of that nature where like the length of it is kind of variable. Like I said, it would be a good jumping off point, but it would also be kind of a good like we're on the way to do something else in this grand campaign that we've planned out, but this particular weekend, a handful of people can't make it, so we're gonna do this little side adventure with the people that we have, and it would be a really good like afternoon quick session. You get through it. Doesn't necessarily have grander implications to anything else, but a way that like it'd be a good little like teaser, taster sample in the middle of your big campaign that might take you months.
And it is a little sandboxy. Like there are multiple directions you can go. There are multiple plot points that you could get wrapped up in. But it is also like a little bit more than bite-sized, It's big enough to spend an afternoon on, but it could also, depending on how you run it as a keeper, expand to something larger. And I do like what you say, like it can be a side point. It could be a location that people are passing through, depending on how you set it up.
Yep, and it's not even necessarily something that you can you would want to plan okay, they're going to go here, but maybe you keep it in your back pocket, and maybe you have okay, they're driving from point A to point B, and they decide to stop for gas in this town. Cool, they stopped here. Now you have something for them to do in that town. So it's not just a stopping point. It's not just okay, you stop and get gas, you get some Twizzlers, you move on to your next thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And even what you're talking about can be removing it from the context. Maybe you aren't working for the university or working for whiskey runners. Maybe you are stopping along the way and these things happen and your people are like, hey, there's something we need to investigate. That's also a great angle for it.
Yeah, it fleshes out the world a little bit, makes it feel more lived in as opposed to, linear storyline. Things are happening in town A, things are happening in town B, the rest of the world is oblivious.
Absolutely. I have to say that of all the modules that I've run, this is my favorite thus far. I think it's incredibly well written. I think people have fun. It's very unsettling. And it also, again, goes back to that creative freedom of the keeper that we previously discussed in our episode.
I'm just thinking back, you said people have a lot of fun. I'm thinking back to when we played it, and one of our investigators decided to put all of their points into jumping. And bless you, you made it work somehow so that they can jump for their safety. And actually, I think the safety of the entire party, because I think they grabbed us on their way out.
Yeah.
But yeah, just roar. I was crying. I was laughing so hard.
I spent the majority of that game figuring out, okay, they want jump so bad, I got to figure out a way to do it. And luckily, there were some great ways to be able to be flexible with which skills were used, and it worked out. Yeah, it was a great moment.
What was that? What was the character's name? Something Butts.
It was Butts.
Cornelius
Butts.
Yeah, Cornelius Butts, the best jumper in the West.
And then after that, they started that game and they were like, I don't even care if this person lives or dies. And by the end, they were like, this is my character. If anybody ever dies, my follow-up character is their descendant.
That person had not only never played Cthulhu, but had never played a tabletop role-playing game. And I caught them later talking to a friend about how they were going to do a D&D campaign, and they were going to have the great ancestor of Cornelius Butts to continue the Butts legacy.
Fantastic. So from there, the other story in the module is Missing Dues. Now, Missing Dues is a lot more linear in structure. There's a little bit of meandering here and there, but essentially what it has to do is you're working for a crime mob boss, lower down, not top, but he has somebody who is supposed to be paying him, should we say, rent for doing jobs in a neighborhood, and he hasn't paid up. And so you're supposed to track down this person. From there, it gets into the artifacts that were stolen are, ritualistic in nature and cause all sorts of cosmic horrors. What are your thoughts on this one?
I liked it. Like you said, it's a little more linear. This one, I think because the module starts off with one that is very applicable to whatever scenario you're kind of looking at, like we just talked about. It's very sandboxy. This one felt a little more kind of one-shotty. This one felt like you might be able to start it off, like start a campaign this way, and like after the experiences of this, you decide to either go straight or you make a crew of criminals that are going to do whatever. But it did feel a lot more self-contained and kind of almost like quick starty. Like it almost felt like it could have been an alternative quick start guide that we could have done in our episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was interesting. I love like gangsters and stuff. I love the like, listen here, see?
Yeah.
Like, I love that. And it's very that. But it did feel a little more kind of bare bones than I think Blackwater Creek did.
Yeah. Well, and with Blackwater Creek, you can have characters from so many diverse backgrounds. But with this one, there has to be a reason that they're working for a mob boss.
Yeah.
Whether that is because they are gangsters themselves or because they owe this person something.
Yeah, or undercover detectives or something. But
yeah, it's a little bit less free with what you can do.
Those are kind of your three options.
This is definitely one that I like to run if somebody says, hey, can you run us a game and it's just a one shot? I just need an afternoon of fun. I don't want to get committed to something. Yes. Curiously enough, this is also the only time I've ever had a TPK.
Oh.
Yeah, the investigators could not unravel what the mystery was, despite even being giving... there's a system in Cthulhu where you can give them a role for previous understandings, and basically you give them the clue that they need, and even with that, and maybe I just wasn't doing my job, but in the end they basically just gave up, and there's a door that they can walk in that leads to basically the end of existence, and they walked into the door. They knowingly walked into the door being like, you know what, I got nothing left. Yeah, in fact we had gone through 2 characters and given spare characters before the 3 just died at the end. Yeah. So very, very difficult. Really cool lore.
Yeah.
I do enjoy. I think this one has a little bit more of a grounded mystery. These items bring about the end times. They've been uncovered. They did bad things with them.
Yeah. Because X, therefore Y.
Yeah. Whereas with Blackwater Creek, there's a lot more. Ooh, it could be this. It could be that.
You never really get a firm X led to Y. You just get the Y.
Yeah. And in that case, some people may finish the campaign without even uncovering why it happened in the first place. This one, you have to uncover it if you want to, quote unquote, beat it.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
So the last thing that we have in this pack is the Keeper Screen. Mm-hmm. Now, the Keeper Screen, in my experience, is so valuable because they often contain charts and statistics. Now, you were actually a little bit surprised.
Yeah, so this is the first Keeper Screen that I've seen the hallowed side of. I've only ever been on the anxiety side of it. And I always kind of assumed that on like a Keeper Screen that was like bundled with a module, that you would have some stuff on like key players. Like maybe you would have the stats of the crime boss. Maybe you'd have the stats of the mayor of Blackwater Creek. And it's not that. It's very general. And like thinking back on it, like, yeah, that makes sense. You want to be able to use this screen for more than one campaign or one shot. Mm-hmm. But like looking at it, it was just kind of very like, I don't know. I think being on the other side, I had hyped up what was on the other side of the screen a lot for myself. And kind of like when you're like a student, you're like, oh, the teacher's lounge. And then like one day you get to go in there because like a teacher needs your help carrying something. And it's just like a table and chairs.
There's
you're convinced there's like a pinball machine in there, and there's like a very broken water cooler.
This goes back to our conversation of sometimes sometimes the unknown or the indescribable nature of something is better than the grounded reality.
Sometimes the inside of the onion is rotten while the outside looks very nice.
Yes. You're right. It is far more grounded. You would be correct in saying that there are actually some screens that are more specific. For instance, Chaosium creates a much larger campaign, which takes forever to run through, and I've never even done it, but I own it, which is Masks of Nyarlathotep, which is a monster from Lovecraft horror. And the screen for that one does actually contain characters and who their connections are and things like that. So it's far more specific. This one, though, excels in the fact that you're supposed to use it with any campaign.
Right.
You have statistics on it for things like weapon damage, what happens when you reach insanity, how combat looks, things like that.
Yeah, it seems like it's laid out well so that the things that are going to be common mechanics that you're going to use a lot, you can quickly pull up. And I think that that's something that is obviously needed. The bulk of my experience with tabletop role-playing games is Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't know if I've ever played a campaign where the DM didn't have to look up the rules for jumping, climbing, or swimming. Because for whatever reason, no one can remember those rules. And I feel like those are things that should be on the screen. This screen seems like it has a lot of those kinds of things. Like, okay, this is probably going to come up. We need to have this. And like, it's not exhaustive. Like, this screen is not 3 tiers high and 360 degrees around the player, like the DM or anything. But it does seem like the things that you're more likely to need to reference, they're there.
Absolutely. To me, I recommend this kit not only because the modules are fantastic, but the actual screen itself is an invaluable source of information. When you're running a game, you need those stats. You need what happens if I do X, and this does it for you. My only problem with it is that it is actually a bit small. I believe D&D comes with a 4-panel.
Yeah.
This is a 3-panel, and it actually, to me, is that 1 panel short of being a nice, well-rounded size or well-edged side.
Right.
I often run it so that I have my Masks of Nyarlathotep one combined so that I have a bigger screen. But that is a sizable purchase that we won't talk about right now. So my only problem with it is that, it's small. And if you're having a lot of books or pencils and pens and dice and everything as a keeper, which you often do, it's not big enough to conceal everything. And some people don't mind that. Some people think that that's a problem. But regardless, I would recommend buying it to just actually get that information in front of you.
And something that I also think is worth mentioning, because we are talking about things in a physical medium, they're stunning. Like, the artwork in the module itself is beautiful. It's laid out really nice. There's a lot of attention paid to the aesthetics of it. The keeper screen is beautiful. It's a very nice screen. It's aesthetically pleasing, which I know is not always the highest order of, like, should I buy this? But it does totally play a role. Like, I'm not going to buy a book, no matter how good the content is, if the cover looks like crap.
Well, and I think seeing that as a player, you get a bit of ambiance. For sure. Like it's a very mysterious looking scene that sets the tone for what you're encountering. Yeah, absolutely. So overall, I think these are the things that you should read. This is the module that you should consider getting if you're still hooked on the Quick Start Kit, or if you've especially invested in the Keeper rulebook. You can actually get them all bundled together, but you can buy them separately if you're looking to just kind of buy things in small chunks, because we don't all have a fortune, which is the point of this entire podcast.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's it for us today. This is our inaugural episode of Espresso. Cade, you got anything to say before we get out of here?
Don't think so. I'm looking forward to the next episode. I think that it's a lot of fun. We had a great time recording it. And hopefully you guys are enjoying it. If you guys have any feedback or anything, please make it constructive. But if you have any feedback, please don't hesitate to hit us up on social media or shoot us an email. Yeah,
you can find us on all social medias as Cantrips and Coffee. We check them regularly, as well as through email at cantripsandcoffee@gmail.com. We're not fancy enough to have a website, so bear with us. All right, and with that, we will catch everybody on our next episode.